Realm presents Royally Yours, Episode 4.
Jasmine. For the third time that day, Jasmine Karim made her way down the back stairs of the east wing of Buckingham Palace to the Red Salon, where the bridal bouquet awaited spritzing. Miss Jones, the royal florist, had chosen the large room specifically because it was as cool as a refrigerator. The cold would keep the flowers from wilting, she'd explained. The salon was on a different floor from the royal bridal suite, and Jasmine had been scampering up and down between the two rooms all morning. As the soon-to-be bride's lady's maid, Jasmine was in charge of the bridal wardrobe, including care of the exquisite bouquet of divine-smelling flowers. The arrangement had to be kept well hydrated, right up to the ceremony. Hold the water spritzer bottle about 6 inches away from the flowers and give them 10 good puffs every hour, on the hour, Miss Jones had instructed. In truth, Jasmine was glad to have an excuse to get away from the royal suites for a bit. There had been such a palaver that morning between Princess Gracie and Princess Georgie over hats of all things. Although nothing could temper her mood today, Jasmine's lips curved into a silly smile. Prince Richard was marrying his love, Miss Meredith, tomorrow, and it was going to be a glorious day, hat debacles notwithstanding. Weddings made people crazy. Jasmine had been front and centre in all 3 of her sisters' nikahs and knew how tempers could run high for months leading up to the ceremonies. The royal wedding was no exception. Even with a slew of wedding planners and event organisers nitpicking every detail, things had gone awry. But everything would go smoothly tomorrow, Jasmine thought, nodding firmly as she strode toward the Red Salon. Her steps faltered as a horrendous crash echoed through the East Wing hallway. At its heels came the high-pitched yips of a couple of very excited dogs. "What on earth?" she cried, and charged forward. But in her rush to turn the corner and investigate the source of the sounds, Jasmine tripped on her own sturdy Mary Janes and went sprawling onto the carpet. Oof! Winded and utterly mortified by her clumsiness, Jasmine blew loose strands of hair out of her face and pushed herself up. Then she froze, spotting the open doors of the Red Salon. She was positive she'd closed them behind her an hour ago, and the barking was coming from inside. Alarmed, Jasmine lurched to her feet and rushed, or rather hobbled, into the room, coming to an abrupt stop just inside the door. She stared in utter, devastating, disbelieving horror. The table she'd dragged from the French windows to a side wall, as per Miss Jones's instructions to keep the flowers out of the path of direct sunlight, had somehow toppled over, smashing the vase containing the bridal bouquet to the floor. Water, petals, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere, and the corgis were using the bouquet as a chew toy. "Oh, my goodness! Oh, my goodness! Who let the dogs out?" she cried, grabbing hold of her head with both hands. What had happened here? Who'd caused such havoc? She looked around wildly for the culprits, but there was no one in the room except for her and the Queen's corgis, now fighting over the bouquet. "Oh my goodness!" She dashed full tilt to rescue the bouquet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle from her earlier stumble. How had the bloody corgis managed this? "Shoo! Get away from the flowers! And the glass! Bad doggies, bad!" She tried to grab whatever was left of the bouquet and found herself in a tug-of-war with both snarling mutts. Then, as abruptly as the commotion had started, the corgis tired of the game and released the flowers, sending her flying backward onto the ground. Without so much as a look in her direction, the dogs imperiously trotted out of the room. Jasmine didn't waste a second. She shut the doors and locked herself inside. She took a moment to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, while her bosom heaved. She stared in horror at the carnage the dogs had left in their wake. Shredded flowers covered the carpet, and the tangled wire skeleton of the bouquet lay sadly in the middle. Shit. She wondered if the disaster would lead to her being drawn and quartered in the Tower of London. Big, giant dollops of shit! Jasmine buried her face in her hands and groaned. This could not be happening. This was supposed to be the best week ever, leading up to the most romantic day ever. This was supposed to be her chance to prove to everyone that she wasn't here simply because of her father's position as superintendent of the royal household, but that she deserved her promotion from a regular maid at Windsor Castle to Miss Meredith's personal lady's maid. It was by her father's recommendation that she'd been transferred to the palace to attend to the new bride, and she'd already messed it up. Mrs. Christie, the housekeeper of Windsor Castle and Jasmine's old boss, had fought against the promotion. She thought Jasmine was a clumsy, inept twit. Mrs. Christie had been right. With a deep breath, Jasmine drew her hands from her face. Maybe it wasn't all that bad. Maybe. Nope. It was bad. Very bad. She couldn't believe 2 itty-bitty balls of fur had done so much damage in less than 5 minutes. She sank to her knees on the carpet, rocking her body back and forth and calling on Allah for help. But even prayers didn't settle her stomach. She pressed her forehead to the carpet and moaned. If she didn't have to keep her top knot impeccable, not a hair could be out of place as per the housekeeping dress code, she'd have curled into a comma on her side and wept. She was in so much trouble. She flinched as a commotion broke out in an adjoining room. It sounded like Mr. Henry, the assistant to the royal butler, and Ms. Ledoux's personal bodyguard, that sweet Mr. Mike. Jasmine had unpacked and organised the wardrobe of the glamorous pop star and maid of honour, Katrina Ledoux's, the day she'd flown in from America. And even though it wasn't his job, Mr. Mike had helped her carry the heavy boxes up the stairs. Jasmine sat up as the shouting escalated. "Please don't come in here!" Mr. Henry seemed extremely put out about something. Again. Normally a stoic man, he was becoming flustered by the wedding and its myriad complications. The thought of being caught with the destroyed bouquet and being incinerated in the crossfire of Mr. Henry's temper left Jasmine cold. She sprang to her feet and rushed to the ensuite bathroom. It was all she could do not to wail at her predicament. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She even looked a mess. Hurriedly, she splashed her face to cool her cheeks and passed wet hands over her hair to smooth her escaped strands back into place. Slightly better. While she considered her options, run away or confess, she filled a tumbler with water and drank deeply to cool her insides too. She should clean up the room. Destroy the evidence. Yes. Jasmine grabbed several towels from a linen closet and got to work. In the salon, she set the table upright. Then, hitching her maid's uniform up to her thighs, she squatted and began picking up the bigger shards of glass before mopping and re-mopping the floor. She worked quickly and silently, her heart leaping into her throat whenever someone so much as walked past the room. What was going to happen to her? Their Royal Highnesses would never forgive her for ruining their perfect day. She would never forgive herself. Oh, why had she ever agreed to take on such responsibility? She should never have let the pep talks from Benji, her best friend and palace colleague, bolster a false sense of confidence in her. She was not meant for stress and... Wait. Benji. Jasmine blinked at the sopping mess in her hands. Benji, of course. He was the answer. But where in the world was he? She sat back on her haunches, frowning. Was he back from his flower-buying trip? He had to be. The wedding was tomorrow. And hadn't he left her a message yesterday, and she'd forgotten to call him back? She smacked her forehead, getting to her feet. Then she stopped short. Ugh. She'd promised Papa that she'd quit running to Benji every time she got in trouble. She was an adult now, nearly 22 years old. She had to grow up and fight her own battles. Her father's disappointed face swam before her eyes, but was immediately replaced by his expression of horror as she got arrested, handcuffed, and taken to prison by royal decree. Jasmine shuddered. She had no choice here. And who better to help her with a flower-related emergency than the junior royal gardener, who also happened to have a degree in horticulture? A sprig of hope bloomed inside her as she pulled her phone out. "Benji, I need your help."
Benjamin. "Well, it took you long enough to return my call," Benjamin Marsh growled into his phone as he pushed himself to his feet in the back gardens of Buckingham Palace. "And you're only calling because you need my help. Tisk, tisk." He tried to sound annoyed, but he couldn't help the grin that split his face at the sound of Jasmine's voice. He'd missed her. He'd been gone close to a month, his longest out-of-town buying trip to date, and the first thing he wanted to do upon returning was to see her face. But she'd been busy with her royals for the past 2 days. Her aggrieved intake of breath made his grin crack wider. His bark had never fooled her. She knew he'd help, after giving her a bit of grief. "I'm sorry for not calling sooner, but it's been bonkers around here. Please don't be mad. Something truly awful has happened, Benji." Her voice wobbled, underlining her worry. "What is it, little flower?" Benjamin quickly packed up his gardening tools and started striding toward his truck, parked close to a clump of trees. "I can't tell you over the phone. Where are you, Windsor?" He cleared his throat as embarrassed heat crept up his body. That was where he was supposed to be, helping his father and uncle, joint head gardeners of the royal estates, deal with those nincompoop wedding decorators who wanted to dig up rows of painstakingly manicured shrubbery so that they could temporarily install party tents. And where was he instead? Hanging around the bright, sunlit gardens of Buckingham Palace, just to be close to her. Naturally, he wasn't about to tell her all that. For the umpteenth time, he wondered why he didn't just tell her how he felt. "I'm here at the palace, actually. I'd work in the gardens." He trailed off, shrugging. "Oh." She sounded surprised, then ecstatic. "That's wild. Does that mean you have your car?" "I have my tree pruning truck," he said slowly. "Can you come to the terrace outside the Red Salon? Or wait, it would be better if I came to you." There was a pause, then. "I'll meet you on that gravel patch behind the chapel. Can you be there in 10 minutes? Oh, and don't tell anyone," she added cryptically and hung up the phone. Wondering what all the cloak and dagger stuff was about, Benjamin climbed into his green truck and cheerfully drove around the palace grounds to meet his Jasmine. "Fool," he muttered to himself. "She's not your Jasmine." It was a bad habit of his, muttering to himself when he was alone, and thinking that Jasmine was his when he knew that she was off limits to him. Jasmine would marry a man of her own faith, just as her sisters had, just as her father expected of her. Jasmine adored her father. She would not disappoint him, which made Benjamin nothing more than a big sappy fool to continue to moon over her. He was better off pouring his hopes and dreams into his business plans. Unlike his father's and her father's steady jobs within the royal household, he didn't want to work as a junior gardener forever. He'd always wanted more. He wanted to explore the world, which made his wholesale flora business perfect, as it would give him the freedom to travel. By next year, he hoped to become a regular supplier, and not just a buyer at the Oldsmere flower auction in the Netherlands, the largest flower market in the world. Jasmine didn't understand this wanderlust. She was a homebody, content to work for the royals like her father and grandfather had. She didn't want to see the world, or so she said. Her family was her world. He should forget her, move on. But she'd called him today. She needed him today, and wild horses couldn't— "Fuck me!" Benjamin slammed his foot on the brake, nearly ramming his face against the steering wheel as the truck skidded to a stop on the gravel path by the Royal Mews. He glared at the two giggling ladies, one in a bold red cocktail dress, the other in a glittering blue mini, who'd suddenly run out in front of the truck. The sun bounced off the blue dress, nearly blinding him. "Sorry, sorry," the lady in blue shouted in an American accent, waving at him, while the lady in red shot him a dazzling smile. She was stunningly beautiful. Even Benjamin, who only had eyes for his Jasmine, had to admit it. She tapped her forefinger to her lips in a shushing motion without breaking her stride. Benjamin stared after the women as they ran off. That couldn't be. He shook his head vigorously, trying to understand what he'd just seen. His hair flopped onto his forehead, blocking his view, and he shoved it back with a curse. He needed a bloody haircut, and stared at the receding apparitions until they disappeared behind the shrubbery. What in the world was going on at the palace? Was this why Jasmine had called him in a panic? Frowning, he threw the truck back into gear, and had barely driven forward 20 paces when he was flagged down by 2 men jogging toward him. Benjamin recognized Mr. Poker-up-his-arse Henry Stockbridge and his crease-free grey suit and ridiculous purple tie. But he'd never clapped eyes on the other bloke before, a big man in a leather jacket and mean shades, though he was starting to get an inkling as to who he might be. Which meant the giggly ladies had been who he'd thought they were. Fuck. Did you see anyone go past? Henry gasped as he stopped by the truck, clearly winded from his sprint. The man was not an athlete. The big bloke, who looked like a WWE wrestler, stopped right next to him, giving Benji the eye. Benjamin considered shrugging and letting the ladies have their bit of fun. Bringing Mr. Poker-up-his-arse down a rung or two would be a nice bonus. Any other day, Benjamin would have sided with the ladies, but the royal wedding was in less than 24 hours. Playtime is over. They went toward the mews. He jerked his chin in the direction of the shrubbery. "Let's go," said the wrestler dude, and the men dashed off, with Henry throwing a "Thank you! Let's keep this to ourselves, shall we?" over his shoulder. More than a little bemused by the strange episode, Benjamin drove the rest of the way without further stops, and parked the truck by the chapel wall. He jumped down from the truck and texted his Jasmine. "Thy knight and steed have arrived and await thy orders to vanquish the beastly dragon that has upset thee." It suddenly occurred to him that Jasmine's dragon could quite possibly be Henry Stockbridge. The man had turned into a royal pain in the ass for the past month, according to the staff grapevine. And Benjamin had let him go without confronting him. Bugger it. Some knight he was turning out to be. On cue, Jasmine was there, walking. No, limping toward him and carrying 2 large garbage bags while repeatedly looking over her shoulder. He marched up to her and bowed with a flourish. "At your service, fair maiden." When she didn't roll her eyes at his horseplay, he knew it was serious, and when he took in how impossibly untidy she looked, wisps of her glossy black hair had escaped her bun, and her stockings had runs in them, breaking stringent palace protocol, he knew it was beyond serious. "Did you hurt yourself?" he asked, taking the bags from her immediately. "Twisted my ankle, it's nothing," she said, sighing heavily, then smiled at him. "Hi, thanks for meeting me." "No problem. You know," he began casually as he dumped the bags in the back of his truck. They didn't smell of garbage. If anything, they were giving off a floral perfume. "All this sneaking about makes us look guilty as hell." Jasmine shot a frantic look around, her heart-shaped face stricken. "You think someone's watching?" But Benjamin was too concerned to take his eyes off her. "Tell me what's going on. Is it Henry? Or is it the bride? Are we helping her escape by sneaking her clothes out in garbage bags?" He'd taken a wild guess. The bags could be filled with clothes. Scented clothes. "What?" Jasmine gaped at him, her mouth forming an O of astonishment. Benjamin cocked his head, wondering if she was trying to cover for the princess-to-be, or if she really had no clue. "You didn't know Meredith and her maid of honour have run off? They ran past me when I was driving here. Henry and some biker bloke are giving chase. It's certainly been an eventful 15 minutes, I'll say." "My goodness, she's run away!" Jasmine's eyes widened into huge circles, confirming she'd had no idea. She did have the most beautiful eyes, dark and slumberous, and rimmed with long, sooty lashes. "There won't be a wedding?" "Oh, I'm sure Henry will bring her back in time, even if he has to hog-tie to do it," Benjamin chuckled. "It explains why Mr. Henry was so angry outside the Red Salon." Jasmine shuddered, then her small shoulders drooped. Oh, Benji, I've had the most trying day. Then she did something she'd stopped doing when she'd turned 16 and he 18. She stepped close, so close that she could rest her forehead against his chest, right over his heart.
Jasmine. Comforted by the sheer strength of Benji's presence and the steady rhythm of his breathing, Jasmine felt some of the tension drain from her body. She'd always felt safe and happy around him, like the world was their playground and no adventure was impossible. But that was his philosophy, not hers. For her, everything seemed impossible.
Are you using my t-shirt to wipe the sweat off your face, or the snot from your nose?
He asked, making her smile. He was always teasing her.
Ladies don't sweat, they perspire,
she said primly, and lifted her head to pout at him. Gosh, when had he gotten so tall, so big? He towered over her by several inches now. He'd grown a beard in the month she hadn't seen him. It made him look older than his 24 years. Absently, she noticed that his mischief-filled moss-green eyes matched the colour of his Henley exactly. And, despite his teasing, worry creased his face as he searched hers for answers.
Tell me what's going on,
he murmured soothingly. She'd heard him croon like that at an injured kid goat they'd found while playing in the fields surrounding Oakley Green, a village just west of Windsor Castle, where their families hailed from. They'd stayed with the goat until the other children had run into the village and brought back the vet. Did she remind him of an injured kid then? Jasmine straightened her spine.
I'm in such trouble, Benji. I was in charge of hydrating the bridal bouquet. I don't know why they'd give me such responsibility,
she said, feeling a lump in her throat again.
Never mind that,
she told herself sternly.
Stick to the point. I went to spritz the bouquet as I was supposed to, as Miss Jones had said I should every hour. But when I got there, it was a disaster. I have no idea how the Queen's corgis got into the room. I'd shut the door when I left, I swear.
Is someone accusing you of lying?
He asked, his face tightening with anger.
No,
she said quickly.
No one else knows. But those two hellhounds gobbled up the bouquet like dessert.
Jesus. They were eating the flowers? Did they eat any of the lily of the valley?
The alarm in his voice spiked her own nerves.
Possibly. They ate most of the flowers. The bouquet is nothing more than a mass of wire and glue now. Why?
She asked, her stomach curdling again. He looked as if he didn't want to answer.
Lily of the valley is poisonous.
Jasmine pressed her hands to her mouth to hold back a scream. Would nothing go right today? She wondered which crime was going to get her guillotined, destruction of the bridal bouquet, or poisoning the Queen's corgis.
That's it, isn't it?
She crossed her arms over her stomach, feeling sick.
I have to confess everything now. I've killed those poor corgis.
She swayed and would have fallen if Benji hadn't caught her arm and helped her lean against the truck. At the same time, he took out his phone from his jeans pocket and began texting. Jasmine pulled out her own phone.
Should I call the vet? Do you think he can save them?
He looked up from the phone, green eyes dancing in merriment. He was laughing at her, as usual.
My life is falling apart and you think it's funny?
She wanted to smack him.
I'm going to be fired, possibly arrested. Either way, I'm screwed. I have no other skills. I never went to college like you did, like you urged me to do. Never explored another vocation. I only trained for a palace job.
Okay, so maybe she was being a tad melodramatic. Blame all those South Asian TV dramas her family was hooked on. He sighed and held up his phone, displaying his text to a footman who also walked the dogs. Benji.
Check on the dogs. They may have eaten flowers from the garden. Lily of the valley. Take care of them and keep me updated.
Stuart.
Will do. Thanks for the heads up, mate.
I should have thought of that myself.
Jasmine admitted sheepishly.
You would have, once you'd calmed down.
Benji said cheerfully. His confidence in her made her flush with embarrassed pleasure.
Now then, let's sort out the bouquet crisis and avoid that jail time, yeah?
He burst out laughing when she smacked his arm. But the truth was that Benji's pragmatic, laughing presence was just what she'd needed. To hell with ladylike decorum, Jasmine threw her arms around her best friend and squealed her thanks. And when his arms stole around her and hugged her back, she thought it might all turn out okay. They drove out of the palace gates without issues. The palace security checked the truck from top to bottom and back to front, and no one thought anything untoward about the garbage bags in the back seat. Benji was the official junior gardener, and they were used to seeing his vehicles laden with foliage-filled bags. Jasmine couldn't believe they'd successfully smuggled the bouquet corpse out of the palace. She wasn't going to prison. Not yet, anyway. Safely away from the palace, Benji parked the truck on a side street so they could brainstorm. Eagerly, Jasmine turned to him.
We need to dump the garbage bags far away from the palace. But first, we need to find a discreet florist who'll fix us a new bouquet and won't spill the beans. I've pictures of the bouquet from every angle. And I believe there were 7 white calla lilies, 7 blue hyacinths, the grape or muscari kind, 7 lily of the valley, and 7 sprigs of baby's breath, with a silver and blue ribbon wrapped around it all. See? I did listen during our gardening conversations. Oh, and I'll pay for the new bouquet, whatever it costs.
She'd break into her savings if need be.
We have bigger problems than discreet florists, little flower.
Benji threw her a grim smile.
You forgot the myrtle. Every royal bouquet has myrtle in it, and it must come from the royal gardens at Osborne House. It's a royal tradition.
She had forgotten about Queen Victoria's myrtle. She sat back in her seat, cursing her fate. She really wasn't having a very good day.
So, now what?
When do they need the bouquet? When will they start missing it?
Jasmine racked her brains for an answer.
Based on the wardrobe changes scheduled for Miss Meredith, I don't think until very early in the morning tomorrow.
She paused, then remembered something.
Oh no! Miss Meredith's mother wanted to have a look at it tonight.
Benji glanced at the dashboard clock. It was past 1 now.
Osborne House is on the Isle of Wight. Not exactly down the road. It's a 3.5-hour journey there. That makes it a 7-hour round trip, not counting the time we spend on the ferry to get us to the island. I don't think we can make it back before midnight.
He blew out a breath.
Not with the road blockades and bumper-to-bumper traffic around London because of the wedding.
Then I'm doomed,
Jasmine said hoarsely. That lump was back in her throat.
Do you remember the Australian walkabout trip you wanted us to take a couple of years ago? I'm game for it now. Let's head straight to the airport.
Benji laughed as though she were kidding. She wasn't.
As much as I'd love for us to take that trip, don't be a coward. Running away isn't a solution.
Helpful, pragmatic, and judgmental. Jasmine sniffed.
Easy for you to say.
Let's figure this out,
he said at the same time. They looked at each other and grinned. They did that a lot, talked over each other. She flapped her hand, giving him the floor.
I've proposed my plan. It's your turn.
He had a few different ideas, it turned out. Jasmine sat in silence, and then dawning awe, as Benji made phone call after phone call, trying to organise a myrtle coup for her.
Miss Jones, please.
Jasmine tensed when he called the royal florist.
Why do we need to call her?
She really didn't care for Miss Snobby Jones at all. Slashing his hand through the air, In a shushing gesture that irritated her, he purred into the phone.
Minnie, it's Benjamin. I'm splendid, thank you. I hope the myrtle was all right. No, I haven't seen it. Oh, I'm sure it's beautiful.
Of course he was on a first-name basis with the royal florist. Jasmine wasn't even surprised. But she was surprised by the quick surge of annoyance coursing through her at his flirty tone. Benji grew silent, listening to Minnie chatter on. He refused to meet Jasmine's eyes as he did so, which meant the woman was flirting back. Who could blame her? What woman wouldn't flirt with a handsome, rugged blonde man with muscular forearms that flexed when his fingers drummed against his dirty brown steering wheel? Jasmine had a sudden, inexplicable urge to snatch Benji's phone from his hand and fling it out the window. Finally, Benji began talking.
I'm actually calling about the myrtle. We have need of it at Windsor for the garden decorations and... Oh, but I brought you a whole bunch.
He paused, his nostrils flaring as he listened to Miss Jones's explanation.
I see. No, it's all right. Yep, mum's the word. Goodbye.
He gave Jasmine a sidelong glance.
She doesn't have any left. Seems she's been selling it to half the brides in London who want a bit of royal magic in their bouquet. Minnie's made herself a tidy little profit on people's royal obsession.
He rubbed a hand over his face and cursed.
Bugger it.
Next, he tried the gardeners at Osborne House to find out if anyone was coming up for the wedding and if they could bring the myrtle with them. Alas, most of the staff who were coming were already on their way to London, and the rest were not planning to come at all. To Jasmine's surprise, he even tried his friend, who also happened to be the royal helicopter pilot. Unfortunately, with so many celebrities arriving for the wedding, he was busy all day, and knew of no other pilot who'd do them a favour and not charge an arm and a leg for the ride.
Right. Confession time.
That was 3 strikes now. It was time to throw in the towel.
If you say confession one more time, I won't be responsible for what I do. Since when did you turn into a Debbie Downer?
He switched on the right turn indicator and manoeuvred the truck onto the road. Jasmine pressed her lips into a thin line, hurt.
Easy for you to call me names. You don't know what it's like to always make mistakes. To have your father's head hang in shame because of you. I just want to do one thing right. Is that too much to ask?
Silence bounced between them for a few minutes. Perhaps she'd said too much.
No, little flower. I'm sorry for what I said.
He apologized gently.
Now then, why don't we get the myrtle from somewhere else? I mean, it's not as if anyone can tell if the myrtle comes from Osborne House.
Jasmine gasped.
Benji! I will not let you put any old myrtle in that bouquet and claim it's Queen Victoria's. It's dishonest, and it will bring bad luck. If there's nothing to be done, I'm ready to take the blame. But I won't cheat. I won't do that to the royal family.
In that, she was resolute.
I know you won't. I know you, don't I?
Benji quirked a dark blonde eyebrow high.
Anyway, that's not what I meant. I know of another place where we can find Victoria's myrtle. Right here in London.
Benjamin. It was more than an hour later that Benjamin pulled the truck to a stop at the end of Bishop's Avenue. It had taken 3 times as long as usual to get there from Westminster, due to the unusual amount of traffic in London. "Are we at Fulham Palace?" Jasmine asked as they began to make their way across the path that led to the Tudor-style manor in the distance. Benjamin nodded, then inhaled deeply, letting the fresh spring air fill his lungs and his soul. He simply loved being outdoors, surrounded by nature. "I'm sorry for ranting at you about the fake myrtle, but I can't be dishonest." He laughed, shaking his head fondly at his Jasmine. "We're sneaking around, trying to replace an entire bouquet without being caught, and you won't be dishonest." Twin poppies blossomed on her cheeks from his teasing, making her even more beautiful to him. She punched his arm but grinned. Papa says traditions are important. They make us who we are. Tradition meant that Jasmine could never be his. So no, he didn't much care for tradition. Do you really think we'll find the royal myrtle here? She was trying not to sound hopeful. If I remember correctly, there should be 4 of Victoria's myrtle bushes in the walled garden, just behind the manor. I came here with my father once, about a dozen years ago, to exchange saplings and stories with the head gardener. They cut across the fresh green lawn, going around the east facade of the main building, where patches of bluebells and daffodils danced in the afternoon breeze. Benjamin sighed in appreciation of the welcoming beauty of Fulham Palace and its surrounding 13 acres of verdant botanical gardens. He could see why it was a popular picnic spot for families and lovers, and a sought-after venue for weddings and private events. However, the place was surprisingly deserted at the moment, and the restaurant attached to the manor was closed. Before Benjamin could wonder why, they were stopped by a tall, slender lady in blue overalls and a bright yellow shirt, pushing a wheelbarrow of mulch. "And where do you think you're going?" she asked, squinting at them from beneath her yellow sun hat. She was lovely, in a weathered kind of way, her long face tanned and rich with lines. His best guess that she was either a groundskeeper or a gardener. "Afternoon, Mum. We'll be taking a stroll to the walled garden today," he said, giving her a brilliant smile. But she was already shaking her head. "The park's closed for maintenance, dearies." Bugger it. Why hadn't he checked the palace website before coming? Hopelessness clouded Jasmine's face, and Benjamin couldn't bear to see it there. "Think, man, think. Can you give us a moment, sweeting?" He winked at Jasmine, urging her not to despair. "I want a private word with..." He turned back to the frowning woman. "I'm Benjamin, junior gardener at Windsor Castle. May I ask who you are?" "Sondra. I'm a volunteer gardener here," she replied, eyeing him with a little more respect. Jasmine narrowed her eyes as well and opened her mouth to respond, but then thought the better of it. She sighed and stepped away like he'd asked. When she was out of earshot, Benjamin gave Sondra his broadest, most charming smile, and poured his heart out. Within minutes, Sondra was waving him and Jasmine along, while she resumed pushing the wheelbarrow to the beds that needed mulching. "What did you say to her?" Jasmine shot him an odd look. It wasn't all like he'd expected. It was disapproval. "My goodness, you can charm the pants off just about any woman, can't you? If you must know, I told her we were sweethearts, and I wanted to propose to you next to a specific myrtle bush because it holds a special meaning to us." And he'd been quite pleased with his spur-of-the-moment brilliance, until Jasmine had questioned his character. Is that what she thought of him? That he was some unscrupulous player? "It was the only way to convince her. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable," he added stiffly. Her face went poppy red again. "Oh, no, it's fine. I mean, you had to give her a good reason. A convincing fib." Only it wasn't a fib, damn it. Why couldn't he just tell her how he felt, lay his heart bare and get his answer once and for all? Because once his feelings and his intentions were out in the open, and she rejected both, their friendship would break. So mooning over her from a distance was the only option. To diffuse the awkwardness that had descended upon them, he told her the story of how Queen Victoria's myrtle came to be planted at Fulham Palace. "The place used to be the official residence of the Bishop of London. It's a museum now, as most historical houses are these days," he said, guiding Jasmine under the thick brick stone archway of Tudor Gate, which led into the walled garden. "Anyway, it so happened that Bishop Charles James Blomfield, then Bishop of London, had been one of the officiants at Queen Victoria's wedding to Prince Albert. The bishop had a gardener's soul, and he'd remarked on the lovely fragrance emanating from the Queen's bouquet. The Queen, being a young romantic herself, and someone who was passionate about flowers and their symbolism, gifted him the bushes for his private gardens at his estate. Since then, the myrtle bushes at Fulham Palace have become symbols of the Queen's regal and generous spirit." Benjamin stopped in the middle of a crossroad, wondering which path would take them to the myrtle. He tried to remember where he'd seen the bushes. As he told Jasmine, myrtle flowers had a distinctly sweet smell, so if nothing else, he hoped his nose would lead the way. "This way, I think. Through the Nook Garden." He'd forgotten how meticulously planned these gardens were. If they'd had more time, he'd have liked to meander through them, taking a closer look at the beehives and the Quercus ilex, the 500-year-old ancient evergreen oak that was the pride of the palace. They passed a hedge maze, and it brought up memories of them playing hide-and-seek in the labyrinths at Windsor Gardens as children, when the royal family wasn't in residence, of course. Aha! I didn't forget. There they are. Benjamin charged up the central garden path, eager to inspect the beautiful star-shaped white flowers up close. They were simply perfect. Elated, he spun around, watching Jasmine come to him. Her ankle was troubling her enough that her pace had slowed considerably, but she was smiling, laughing at him in fact. He'd done it. He'd made his Jasmine happy. He'd slain at least one dragon for her. Then Benjamin did a double take as he spotted Sondra beaming at them from behind the maze. Was she following them to witness the proposal? Fuck. He took both of Jasmine's hands in his and bent his head as if to kiss her while whispering urgently, "Don't be alarmed. Sondra's watching, so we need to put on a show." "Oh," she tensed, but didn't yank her hands away. "Okay." He went down on one knee, slowly, with gravitas. What are you doing?" Her Bambi eyes widened into circles of surprise. "Proposing." He kissed the back of her hand. "Make moon eyes at me." She burst out laughing. "You're such an arse. What in heaven's name are moon eyes? Don't laugh at me, woman. You're supposed to be dazzled by the prospect of marrying me." She fluttered her eyes, but acted appropriately bedazzled, even going so far as to flutter her abundant eyelashes at him. She made a lovely picture as she posed in her white maid's uniform, her face lit with laughter and the myrtle bushes fanning out behind her. He was pretty bedazzled himself. He stood up then, still gazing into her eyes. He had the odd sensation of drowning in the black, fathomless pools that seemed to see him so clearly. Or was it the potent scent of the earth and the flowers that intoxicated him? Her smile slipped, and yet he couldn't stop staring, couldn't look away. She was no longer relaxed or laughing. But she didn't break eye contact or step away either. Her tongue darted out and wet her lips. Then her mouth curved upward in a hesitant smile, one of gratitude. Benjamin closed his eyes. He didn't want her gratitude. He wanted her heart.
"Jasmine, Sondra's gone," said Benji as he dropped her hands, breaking their connection. Jasmine sighed out the breath she'd been holding, feeling relieved and something else. Something she couldn't identify. They'd been staring into each other's eyes, in jest, as an act for Sondra's benefit. And then something had happened. There had been a moment when it hadn't felt like a lie.
"The myrtle looks spectacular,"
Benji said.
"Healthier than I'd expected. I've been a tad worried about the state we'd find him in, but no worries now."
The bushes stood several feet tall and several feet wide, each one touching the other as if they needed the contact. Jasmine still wasn't thinking clearly. He'd gone down on one knee and... Stop it! It had been a show, and now the show was over. She cleared her throat. "They smell divine. Their scent is so much stronger here than in the bouquet."
"Always so, love. Flowers always smell better in their own environments,"
he explained, while his eyes scanned their immediate surroundings. For Sondra, or any other witnesses, perhaps? There were several gardeners around, busy with spring work.
"Looks clear. Quick, open my backpack."
He clipped 2 2-foot branches with just bloomed white flowers. Within minutes, they were on their way back to the truck, in silence. Was he feeling awkward about the fake proposal? This time, it was Jasmine who spotted Sondra. Acting quickly, she slid her hand into Benji's and plastered her body against his, as a giddy-headed, newly engaged girl might do. Goodness, he was so warm. And without meaning to, she cuddled closer. She felt a butterfly of a kiss on the top of her head, and it sparked a funny little flutter in her stomach. He was simply acting. She needed to remember that. Back at the truck,
Benji carefully spread out the branches on the back seat. And then they were on the road again.
We pick up the rest of the flowers from your flower guy, and then to Windsor?
She asked, staring straight through the windshield to the road ahead. She couldn't look at him. She was so embarrassed by what she was feeling, so worried that it showed on her face. Benji grunted in confirmation. He hadn't said much since the episode either. He wasn't being an arse about it, teasing her or milking it for every blush he could get out of her. Which was strange, wasn't it? Why was he passing up a chance to tease her? And what was stranger was that she missed it. Missed his adorable buffoonery. She couldn't stop thinking about how wonderful he'd looked in that garden. How handsome he still looked right now, with his overlong, sun-kissed hair surrounding his face like a halo, his full pink lips highlighted by his thick, dark blonde beard, his green eyes, so warm and yet so serious as they stared out the windshield. Goodness, she had to stop this line of thinking. They were friends, best friends, and this was crossing a line. And then she turned to the window and saw him. And all thoughts of Benji flew from her mind. Jasmine shrieked and dove for the truck's floor, somehow stuffing her body under the dashboard in the time it took to drop a hat. Hats! This whole day had gone to shit, starting with the hats. Ow! She flinched as her swollen ankle cried out in displeasure at being abused. When she glanced up, Benji was gaping down at her, as if she'd lost her mind. She was beginning to think she had too. He continued to gape at her for so long that the truck veered off its lane and car horns blasted all around them. Benji swore a blue streak, fighting to get back into their lane before glaring at her again, this time with one eye on the road.
Do you wish to explain yourself?
He said through gritted teeth. She supposed she owed him an explanation for her bizarre behavior, which she was already regretting, ankle and all. Perhaps a simple turn of the head away from him would have sufficed, but it was too late for regrets now.
Didn't you see him?
She whispered, pointing at the window.
Is he still there?
Who in God's name are you talking about?
Mr. Henry. He and Mr. Mike riding on a motorbike right next to us. I pray he's not seen me. I'm not supposed to be outside the palace. I'm supposed to be in the red salon minding the blasted bouquet. If he's seen me, I'm going to be interrogated like a criminal, and all of this running around will be for naught.
Her heart refused to stop galloping inside her chest. Benji's nostrils flared, and Jasmine prepared for his anger at her nearly causing an accident. But instead, he started chuckling. Soon, he was howling with laughter, at her expense.
Mr. Poker up his arse, on the back of a motorbike.
He chortled, wiping actual tears from his eyes.
Right, you can come up now. It's safe.
But of course, her clumsiness manifested in all its glory right then. She couldn't remember how she'd managed to contort herself into a pretzel position under the dashboard of the truck. Unfolding her body wasn't so easy. Her face passed dangerously close to Benji's lap as she rose. And then there was her blasted ankle. They were both red in the face by the time she was sitting demurely in her seat, as close to the passenger door as she could manage without dislocating her shoulder. For the rest of the drive to Windsor, with one stop to pick up a box full of flowers from a wholesaler, Jasmine tried to keep up a cheerily benign conversation. It was difficult, as the mood between them kept flipping like light switches, sometimes normal and sometimes charged. The traffic on the M4 didn't help, making them feel both frustrated and evil-tempered in turn. The English weather wasn't on their side either. The sun played peekaboo in the sky the whole way, until it finally tucked itself behind a vast expanse of angry clouds. Jasmine breathed a sigh of relief when she finally saw Windsor's turrets rising in the distance, looking magnificent against the canopy of gloom and doom. Benji continued to drive up Castle Hill, turning into the service entrance at the end of the road. He slowed down to hail the guards, before driving on to the gardener's quarters. This crazy day was finally coming to an end, she thought, as he pulled up in front of a line of grey stone cottages. But fate, it seemed, hadn't had its fill of making fun of her.
Benjamin. With a spring storm looming overhead, Benjamin jumped down from the truck and opened the back door to gather the boxes of fresh flowers. Packages in hand, he came around the truck just as Jasmine closed the passenger door. "Let me help you carry something," she offered. He shook his head. "Let's get to the greenhouse before the skies open up on our heads." He walked slowly, matching his pace to his Jasmine's. Her ankle was quite obviously giving her trouble now. But when he pointed it out, she told him not to make a fuss. They made it past the vegetable garden and were halfway across the fruit garden when the downpour started. "Go! Run! Save the flowers!" She flapped her hands at him like she was shooing him. "Don't be daft," he said. "A little water isn't going to hurt them. The greenhouse is just behind that little copse of plum trees. Can you make it, or do you want me to carry you?" It was tough to walk on freshly turned earth without proper boots even when it wasn't raining. "I can manage." And she did for about 3 steps. Then she slipped in the mud and lost her balance completely. "Ow! Bloody hell, not again!" Benjamin dropped to his knees beside her, setting the boxes aside. She was holding her ankle with both hands. Water streamed down her sweet face, now scrunched up in pain. He couldn't tell if she was crying. "I think I twisted it again." "Let me have a look at it." She shook her head. "It's fine. The pain's receding already. Go ahead, I'll follow you in a minute." His patience was crumbling like dry earth in the summer. She truly frustrated him at times. "You will not put pressure on that foot again. Why didn't you tell me how bad it was?" "It's not that bad. Just help me up, okay?" She took a deep breath, obviously preparing for the oncoming pain. Stubborn little flower. He didn't bother asking for her permission. He simply scooped her up in his arms and started walking through the rain.
Jasmine. Jasmine was in awe of Benji's sweetness, of his strength, the way he'd gallantly carried her into the greenhouse, and of his talents as a horticulturalist. She craned her neck, trying to take in the whole greenhouse at once. She hadn't been in it for a long time, years in fact, and she'd forgotten what a magical place it was. This Eden in Windsor. Benji's Eden. He carried her to a section of the greenhouse where he'd carved out an office space. He set her down on a stool next to a high-tech workstation. Then, with a quick explanation, he darted back out into the rain for the flowers. She'd barely shifted to a more comfortable position when he was striding back, boxes in hand. He set them down on a long wooden table. She gulped as he shook himself like a wet dog, or like Poseidon riding from the sea. His wet hair curled over his shoulders that were so broad, so capable. He'd carried her as if she weighed nothing at all. Jasmine froze. She was crossing a line again. She lowered her eyes to her throbbing foot, which was stretched out in front of her. With a sharp exhale, Benji went down on one knee again. This was becoming a habit. And before she could think what he meant to do, he removed her shoe. Then he planted her foot on his jeans-clad thigh, wet stocking and all. "It feels swollen," he said, running his fingers from her ankle to the top of her foot. "I'm going to cut your stocking to confirm." She wanted to squirm, though not with pain. "Benji, I'm fine," she said, her voice hardly a whisper. "Let's just get to the bouquet."
Benjamin. "Fuck the bouquet. Benjamin erupted at the end of his tether. "Your well-being is more important than some stupid bouquet." He was so frustrated at his Jasmine for not taking care of herself, for pushing herself past her endurance. He was extra careful as he set her foot down on a stool. Then he stalked into his office, rummaged around for first aid supplies, ice and towels, and stalked back out. "Palm out." She didn't protest and opened her right hand, staring at him with her Bambi eyes. He placed 2 anti-inflammatory tablets on her palm and gave her a bottle of water. Then he squatted again and focused on her ankle. Using a pair of gardening shears, he cut her stocking to just above her ankle and then removed the fabric. He washed and dried her puffy, mud-stained foot before wrapping it in ice cubes and a towel. His frustration abated as he cared for her, because she allowed him to. When he stood up, he took a fresh towel from the pile and began patting her face and hair dry. "I wish you'd take better care of yourself." Then he handed her the towel so she could dry herself. "Don't you dare move," he ordered in no uncertain terms, before he turned to his workstation and got down to putting that blasted bouquet together.
Jasmine. She took his advice and didn't move. Not until her foot was blessedly numb. Then she untied the makeshift ice pack from her ankle and hobbled over to the workstation to watch Benji. She was bowled over by what he'd done for her today, what he was still doing for her. His rugged profile was creased into a frown of concentration as he measured and cut the stalks. He'd taken the pictures of the bouquet from her phone and transferred them to a desktop computer. They were now up on the screen, a blueprint for him to follow.
What can I do? How can I help? She asked, feeling utterly useless. Just stand there and look pretty.
He shot her a wicked grin. She swatted his arm.
Please, let me help. You've done so much already.
Did you know that white calla lilies symbolise regal elegance?
He asked instead, clipping the last of the 7 lilies and adding it to the water-filled bucket to hydrate.
No? Tell me more.
He spoke the language of flowers so well, so passionately.
Baby's breath denotes festivity. Lily of the valley is said to bring luck in love, while these white muscari, which you quite correctly identified as grape hyacinths, symbolise constancy.
He offered her a sprig of constancy. She brought it to her nose, inhaling its enchanting fragrance. Stalk by stalk, leaf by leaf, the bouquet took shape in Benji's charmed hands. He moulded the flowers with wire, made them tilt just so with glue. Soon it began to look exactly like the original bouquet. He picked up the silver and blue ribbon, the final touch. Their adventure had come to an end.
The bathroom is in the back.
She needed to freshen up before returning to the palace and shake off the gloom that had descended on her at the prospect. They'd saved the bouquet. She should be overjoyed.
Yeah, through that Isle of Perennials. Want me to carry it?
Jasmine shook her head.
I can manage now. Thanks for the offer.
Benji gave a curt nod and hunched back over the bouquet. Was he sorry the adventure was over too? Slowly, Jasmine made her way through the shelves filled with clay pots and greenery. She composed herself in the bathroom and took a different route back to the work area. Since she hadn't explored the greenhouse in years, she wanted to see what had changed and what had remained the same. A strong, familiar scent drew her to a section of exotic flowers. She limped past a table of Arabian jasmine that her family often used in tea infusions, and simply froze. Her mouth dropped open as her eyes took in the sea of various kinds of potted jasmines in various stages of bloom, basking merrily under a lovely white and blue sign that read, "My Jasmine." It was the exact way she spelled her name. And Benji had written "my" in front of it. Oh my goodness. What did it mean? What could it mean? Her heart began to throb just like her ankle. Did he mean... She spun around, needing to get to him and get some answers. But she turned too quickly, sending a jolt of pain through her ankle. Ow! Why was she so damn clumsy today? Benji came running at once.
What happened? I told you I'd carry...
He swallowed the rest of his words, gaping at the sign above her head, then at her. Myriad expressions crossed his face, from shock to embarrassment to an endearing sheepishness. It would have been comical, except that her entire body felt electrified by the intensity in his moss-green eyes as he looked at her. He shoved a hand through his golden locks, while a fiery blush spread over his skin, right up to his sun-kissed roots. The movement stretched his damp Henley across the work-hardened muscles of his chest. She refused to avert her eyes and allowed herself to ogle his 8-pack. Something was happening to her, to him, between them. It had been happening all day.
I love flowers, but jasmine is my favourite,
he confessed, moving slowly toward her and stopping about a foot away.
Do you want to know why?
His face was somber now, yet vivid with hope, blazing with love. And she fell, and fell hard. With a cry, she launched herself into his arms and he caught her, laughing as he always did. He opened his mouth, probably to tease her, but she didn't want him to spoil the moment, so she kissed him, deeply. It was heady, intoxicating, to kiss rather than be kissed, and to kiss someone who already meant the world to her. Her heart leaped in her chest when Benji slowly, gently took control of the kiss, increasing the pressure of his mouth, licking her lips with his tongue, as he tightened his arms around her, pressing their bodies closer. When they finally broke apart, they were both panting, as if they'd run a marathon.
I didn't dare hope,
he admitted, his voice guttural.
Your father.
She was still wrapped in his arms, their eyes still locked on each other.
Will want my happiness, just as you do.
Tears of wonder filled her eyes. Benjamin Marsh loved her. Oh my goodness.
What makes you happy, little flower?
He pressed sweet kisses on her face, as if he couldn't help it, as if he'd never stop.
You do, Benji. You always do.
Then she laughed in delight, marveling at the magical turn the day had taken.
So, what now?
And now, my Jasmine, we will embark on our next adventure,
he said, winking at her.
Together.
Benjamin. In the language of flowers, to use myrtle in a bridal bouquet was a blessing upon the bride and the groom. But the best flowers, in horticulturist Benjamin Marsh's opinion, were jasmines, whose very name symbolized beauty, sensuality, and the magic of love.
You're listening to Royally Yours by Falguni Kothari, starring Lorna Bennett and Gary Furlong. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Royally Yours is created by Megan Frampton and written by Megan Frampton, K.M. Jackson, Falguni Kothari, Liz Maverick, and Kat McMurray. It is produced by Lydia Shama and executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.